This is a bilingual session because we have multicultural, multinational participants and delegates at the present. So this is a very special occasion. Let me recognize the distinguished guests, even though the MC already identified several. But let me first start with the Vice Chairperson, Wang, of the National Human Rights Commission. Senior Advisor Yao, and especially I want to recognize Senior Advisor Yao, and most of the delegates, I think all the delegates has visited National Human Rights Museum this morning, and he is the overqualified guide, right? You were lucky to have him to be your guide, and he is not only just trained to be a guide, he is the participant on the human rights struggle of Taiwan over the decades. And that's why we call multi-generational, intergenerational and multi-generational. So I'm very glad to join me, thank him again. National Human Rights Commissioner Wang over there, I'm sorry about you have to sit over there, and Tian and Ye, and Director Yazuski, and he is the head of the Taiwan office for European Center for Security Policy, and he is also our keynote speaker for this afternoon, and also distinguished panelists, and welcome to, and of course, our delegations and participants from various organizations and institutions. Lastly, but not least, our 2025 SEASAT Youth Camp delegates. A very pleasant afternoon to you all. Welcome to the 2025 Human Rights in Asia, a multi-generational dialogue on the current state of human rights in the changing world order. It is an honor for me to open this vital dialogue on human rights in Asia, co-organized by TAEF and National Human Rights Commission. And this is for the second consecutive year. And we are very happy to have a National Human Rights Commission to be on our side. We are witnessing the reconfiguration of an international political alliance, the changing political landscape, domestic political landscape, and the strengthening of nationalism along with populism. It is a volatile context, and in this volatile context, the very foundation of human rights are being tested and even challenged. The future of the future development of human rights in Asia needs to be safeguarded and even strengthened. And that's why at the youth camp, we firmly believe to organize such a multi-generational dialogue on human rights are needed and desirable. In today's time, we are also seeing an extraordinary groundswell of grassroots energy from the frontiers of protest to the quiet persistence of digital organizing in Asia. Young people are leading the charge in advancing and defending human rights for the 21st century. These movements are not only preserving the legacy of past struggles, they are expanding our collective understanding of what human rights mean today. So human rights is not static. Human rights is progressing over time and over human dignity. Across the region, we are witnessing the profound and growing influence of youth in attempting to shape the discourse and direction of human rights. For instance, in Indonesia, we have a delegate from Indonesia as well. Campaigns such as Reformasi di Korupsi and Indonesia Gallup has once played a vital role in reshaping national conversations and highlighting the power of social media and the youth-led movement. It is a powerful reminder that the pursuit of human rights and justice is not confined to legal institutions alone. It is driven by the voices and courage of young people committed to building a more justice future. In the case of Taiwan, young youth activism has had a transforming impact on Taiwan's civil society. The Sunflower Movement in 2014, it's 11 years ago, and the Bluebird Movement in 2024, last year, and the current 2025 Great Record Movement have all together transform and upgrade Taiwan's civil participation. And it not only upgrade the Taiwan civil society involvement in Taiwan's democratic transformation, consolidation, even democratic rescue. So let me tell you, democracy cannot take democracy for granted. Once you have it, you don't necessarily have it all. It might decline, it might set back, and it might die. So the life cycle of democracy, we are experiencing the danger of being declined. So all the above the movement I mentioned since 2014 has strengthened Taiwan's democracy. And on top of that, it also reinforced the public's awareness and oversight over the cross-strait relations. And more importantly, that the people to be more cautious and aware of China's ambition to invade and to annex Taiwan. So Taiwan's youth, over the decades, since about since the 1980s, have actually started the three trilogy of participation, and that affect Taiwan's destiny. One is democracy. Second, national integrity. Third, to defend Taiwan's national identity. As we welcome this year's SEASAT youth leaders to Taiwan, we hope you can not only contribute your own perspective, but also learn from Taiwan's unique past and current experience from the struggle of a previous and today's generation who fought for the freedom, democracy, and national integrity. Taiwan's journey is a powerful testament to the impact of a civic participation and multi-generational persistence and resilience. Many examples from across the region illustrate a powerful truth that young people are not only defenders of existing rights, but also pioneers in expanding what justice and human dignity should look like in today's world. The Taiwan-Asia Exchange Foundation, TAEF, is proud to co-facilitate this new national human right with Human Rights in Asia dialogue with National Human Rights Commission. Through initiative like this dialogue, TAEF provides a platform where human rights can be discussed, not just as inherited legacy, but as a living concept, shaped and reshaped by each generation. Indeed, Taiwan has prioritized youth-centered platform because we believe that the meaningful change does not trickle down automatically. It rises from the ground up through conscious efforts from generation to generation. Today's dialogue is rooted in this firm belief that the young people should not only be included in the conversation about human rights, they should be helping to define it by actual action. Once again, thank you for joining this afternoon's dialogue, and I hope you can enjoy it and bring some idea back home and share your idea with your colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Xiao, for your very thoughtful remarks. 感谢肖董事长的精彩致辞。Next, we are pleased to invite Vice Chairperson of the National Human Rights Commission, Ms. Wang Youling, to share her opening remarks. 接下来，我们有请国家人权委员会副主任委员王幼玲女士来为我们致辞。有请掌声欢迎王幼玲女士。
总统府之政，这个姚之政，还有我们台湾亚洲交流基金会的肖董事长，我们杨浩执行长，还有来自马来西亚跟越南的语坛人西卡尔跟黎怀英，还有我们人权委员会的王龙章委员、田秋瑾委员、叶大华委员，还有各位贵宾，也欢迎来自亚太各国的青年领袖跟各位来宾、公民伙伴跟这个媒体的朋友，欢迎你们。我代表台湾国家人权委员会，要向大家表达诚挚的欢迎。感谢各位心系自由民主跟人权的议题，也感谢大家今天的莅临。去年2024年亚洲青年领袖营获得广大的回响，我们第一次跟这个人权会跟这个亚洲交流基金会有一个合作，所以今年呢国家人权委员会很高兴可以再度跟台湾的这个亚洲交流基金会合作。那刚才肖董事长说希望继续合作下去对，所以我们特别的兴奋。那为这个亚洲各国的这个青年朋友建构了一个深度交流的平台。那今年的营队共有47位学员，分别来自16个亚太的国家，并且具备了人权、科技、法律、政策以及社会创新等多元的背景。我们相信促进青年领袖跟公民社会的直接对谈，是深化人权价值、拓展台湾人权外交最坚实的路径。刚刚其实我们也都谈到，近年来我们可以观察到全球威权主义跟民粹主义的扩张，使得传统人权保障机制面临前所未有的冲击。那现在目前正充满了变动的这个全球局势之下，我们怎么样掌握社会韧性的脉动，是所有这个公共政策专业人员跟公民社会伙伴，跟我们的这个青年伙伴们都非常高度关切的课题。同时，我们也注意到亚太这个各国的青年正透过各种草根的行动。社群串联跟跨国倡议的方式，由下而上的捍卫并且重塑人权的价值跟民主的实现，那成为影响世界未来走向的非常重要的力量。为此呢，今年的这个亚洲跨世代人权对话 论坛特别邀请了跨领域、跨世代、跨国的公共政策跟倡议工作者来分享第一线的观察跟实务的经验。今天我们也将深入的探讨社会韧性、青年行动、国际关系跟台湾公民社会角色的交集，也期盼能够聆听国内外 NGO 跟智库领袖，跟亚太青年代表们的多元的声音，共同来面对台湾、亚太地区乃至于全球所面临到的新的挑战。那从中思考可能因应的这个合作的机会。根据自由之家最新的这个2025年世界自由度的调查呢，台湾今年还是持续的名列前茅，在亚洲国家仅次于日本。那这个台湾在2019年呢，这个成为亚洲第一个将同性恋婚姻合法化的国家。然后随后呢，这个尼泊尔跟泰国也都陆续通过了保障同性婚姻的这个相关的措施。所以台湾的民主进步，其实对这个亚洲国家来说都有一些启发。那我们也绝对不会因此而自满，因为我们相信人权是永无止境的追求。我们认为台湾的人权还有很多的进步的空间，还有很多重要的课题需要面对。台湾现在之所以能够享有多元的开放、自由、民主，绝非一触可成，而是历经非常坎坷艰辛的奋斗，并且受到国内外人权倡议运动工作者跟团体的帮助。在这个我们的历史上，台湾从1949年开始实行戒严，直到1987年才宣布戒严，在2007年呢通过了，就是今天是台湾解除戒严的纪念日。那在这长达38年的这个白色恐怖的期间呢，政府是大肆迫害了这个异议的人士。而很多的这个民主的前辈，包括我们在场的这个姚嘉文执政，也是他们不畏牺牲、前仆后继的争取民主的自由，并且国际社会也持续高度的关注台湾人权发展，并且施压政府，所以才能够撼动威权的统治。根据我们促转会的统计，台湾在戒严时代，总共有22028个人受到政治的审判，其中有1148人被判死刑。也就是这些惨痛的教训呢，在台湾完成了民主的转型后，我们非常乐意分享过去推动民主人权的这个经验跟成果。那今天台湾能够解除戒严，废除惩治叛乱条例，实施总统的直选，经历数次的政党的轮替，然后有这些重大的民主的成果。那也经过20年民间共同的这些倡议跟努力，我们才在2020年8月成立了国家人权委员会。那我们的使命是希望能够落实国际人权公约，然后也希望能够推动国际人权的这个标准，并且期许能够在亚太地区扮演更为积极的角色，为国际人权的进步有所贡献。那昔日台湾在自由民主最黑暗的时候，国际社会这个不求回报的帮助我们也心存感恩，所以我们很乐意帮助其他的国家来追求这个人权。我们也希望随着近来各种新兴挑战的出现推动人权的这个道路上，各国都必须要加强这个合作伙伴的关系，相互的学习。那各位青年领袖，我希望你们这几天能够收获满满，跟台湾公民社会连结这个深厚的情感，并且从台湾的经验获得这启发。我也要向你们每一位表达这个高度的敬佩跟感谢。 那谢谢你们可以把你们自己国家面临的难题以及充满创意的新时代想法分享给我们这些跨国跟跨世代的观点跟经验对台湾也都是相当的这个宝贵追求人权的道路往往都是艰辛的但是我祝福你们在营队结束之后，当你们回到自己的国家。台湾还是愿意一直持续的支持你们继续深耕这个人权的议题，推动进步跟改革，共同为亚太乃至全球的这个自由民主尽一份心力。最后，我也要再次的感谢各位讲者跟来宾谢谢大家，谢谢。
Thank you very much for having me here this afternoon. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to engage with you in this timely an important dialogue about the state of human rights in Europe, in Asia, and beyond in times of geopolitical change, but also in times of democratic backsliding and authoritarian spillover. Next slide. When I think about the idea of human rights and human rights being more of a destination to which as democratic denizens we should constantly aspire rather than an achievement that we have already reached, I really like to recall the metaphor of a shining city upon a hill. That's an image that is quite frequently evoked in US American political discourse. It was the centerpiece, the leitmotif of one of the most famous campaign spots of Ronald Reagan, but it has a much longer history in American political discourse, dating back all the way back to the sermons of the first colonizers of the United States, the Puritans. At the same time, despite the use of the symbol of the shining city upon a hill by forces which are anything but progressive, I think it is important, especially for young leaders, to sort of have these light posts, to have success stories that can guide us in the right direction of making sure that human rights protection regimes are strong and resilient in the context in which we operate, whether it happens at the level of local communities, at national level, or in pan-national cross-contextual structures. At the same time, during the time of the aforementioned geopolitical volatilities and democracy being in decline, it appears that lights in the shining city upon a hill are at least dimmed, if not completely turned off. And in his opening remarks, Dr. Xiao mentioned that we should look at human rights as a living organism rather than a legacy that will continue to be passed on. Today, we ought to ask ourselves whether human rights are really a living concept or a concept that we need to put on life support. So even if we do need to put human rights on life support, let's examine what the issue is, what the diagnosis is, so that we can finish today's conversation with some actionable solutions and some actual treatment to the illnesses of the human rights regime. Next slide, please. There are many ways to measure quality of democracy. We heard about Taiwan's achievements in some of these international indices, for example, those produced by Freedom House. I am quite fond of the work done by colleagues at the University of Gothenburg who regularly come up with a very holistic take on how to define the condition of democracy in their annual VDEM, Varieties of Democracy, indices. And this year's edition of the VDEM report that came out in March of 2025 very clearly demonstrates that indeed the state of democracy and, by extension, human rights protection regimes globally is very much on the decline. So by several measures, we can illustrate that the past 2 decades have failed to bring about the fourth wave of democratization or any other set of global changes of that sort, but rather, in many cases, we actually see U-turns. So countries that were successfully moving towards democracy, that were paying more attention to creating processes and institutions that would strengthen their respective human rights regimes, have begun to decline after that initial period of success. So we can see that in 2024, there's a considerably lower number of countries where we have seen improvement in some of these key measures of varieties of democracy. Improvement in the freedom of expression, 8 countries versus 29 in 2004 is merely one of the examples. And on the second image, you can see that the fervor of democratization, the peak of third wave of democratization that we have witnessed in the 1990s when countries in Central and Eastern Europe were democratizing after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so were many democracies here in East Asia, such as Taiwan, the Philippines, or South Korea. 2024 is quite the opposite. It's the year of authoritarian proliferation. Next slide. So what are some of the examples of these human rights abuses that are plaguing even those countries that often take great pride in calling themselves democratic success stories, such as Taiwan? I would argue that in Taiwan, one of the biggest flaws in the otherwise strong human rights record is the abysmal treatment of migrant workers, a phenomenon on which Taiwan has been called out repeatedly by bodies such as the European Union External Action Service in their annual reports on the state of democracy and human rights, or even some of the bodies within the United States government that put seafood products from Taiwan on the list of products created through indentured labor. Next slide. In Poland, one of the countries that is often mentioned as a democratic success story, not only because of developments in the 1990s, but also the success of liberal parties in 2023 that sought to reverse the damage caused by 8 years of far-right populist rule. The situation on the border with Belarus, in name of protecting national security, is violating international human rights standards, given that only this year, the supposedly liberal Big Tent coalition worked together with the right-wing president to pass a law that suspended the right to seek asylum. Next slide. In the United States, human rights situation is deteriorating in many areas, but it is worth shedding light the fact on the unresolved issue of systemic racism and complete non-compliance of not only this administration, but several administrations with the International Convention on Elimination of Every Form of Racial Discrimination, to which the United States is a signatory. Next slide. So I was asked to shed some light on how European youth are responding to these challenges specifically. And I did want to take on this task. The European Values Center, the think tank which I represent, in 2022 became the first European think tank to establish a permanent office in Taiwan. At the same time, I do want to challenge the task that I was presented with to some extent, because I don't believe that we should keep putting Western players, for example, the European Union, on a pedestal. So while I do bring some of the examples from Europe into this conversation, I very much hope that you see those as an incentive to have more of a horizontal conversation, because, as I mentioned in the very beginning, there is no shining city upon the hill to speak of these days. Anyhow, in the European Union, we benefit from very systematic efforts to address any potential information deficit in how the European Union, as a bloc of 27 member states, tries to understand itself and understand the state of fundamental rights. In 2011, the European Union adopted the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is a set of guiding principles that also justifies the notion that the European Union at least attempts to act as a normative actor in global affairs. So in 2025, we saw the release of the most recent wave of the Flash Eurobarometer study, which is implemented by the European Parliament to understand the perspectives of young Europeans aged between 16 and 30. So we see that to young people in Europe, the protection of human rights, democracy, and peace matters. So there is this recognition of fundamental rights being sources and building blocks of a pan-European identity. However, it is concerning that less than 50% of respondents have indicated that these are top values for them. And then, of course, we can go into the weeds and try to understand how differently do respondents in different contexts conceptualize and operationalize these terms, human rights, democracy, and peace. Interestingly, freedom of speech and thought has taken the second place. And I believe that this is simultaneously an encouraging message that in the era where the spread of information is facilitated through ICT, youth are paying a lot of attention to the importance of safeguarding freedom of speech and thought. But simultaneously, in the era of nationalism, and I don't mean a more positive form of nationalism in the form of civic nationalism, I mean chauvinistic nationalism and populism, we often see that these terms are weaponized and instrumentalized by illiberal, non-democratic forces. Interestingly, human dignity, including the prohibition of the death penalty, torture, and slavery, ranks very high. The question of the abolition of the death penalty appears to be one where European and specifically Taiwanese interlocutors don't seem to find a common ground, seeing that especially among the general public, the support for death penalty in Taiwan regrettably remains quite high. And then values including tolerance and respect for diversity in society and gender equality are within the top 5, but only with about a quarter of respondents claiming these as their own. Next slide. And then how do young people try to act in the public space, both offline and online, to make sure that these values are safeguarded? We see that the most costly, but also arguably the most conventional form of political participation is still the most common one. So voting in elections at various levels. Then we can also engage in a conversation about whether we should still be using the, I would say, somewhat anachronistic notion of slacktivism to condemn online activism as an insufficient tool of political participation. Because doing so might very clearly exacerbate some of the existing generational fault lines in how we understand meaningful participation in social and political phenomena as citizens. So this is again visible in this empirical data from Eurobarometer, because among the top 5 forms of participation, 2 of them are taking place particularly in the online sphere. Creating or signing a petition at number 2, and at number 4, posting opinions online or on social media about a political issue. I think that the last one is quite interesting as well. So young respondents seem to understand the power of the purse, and they have declared that a form of political participation in their eyes was boycotting or boycotting, purchasing an item because of the political, ethical, or environmental reason. Next slide. So I mentioned that especially since 2011, the European Union has taken it very seriously to codify these common norms and values that we talk about as the foundation of the common European civic national identity. And to this end, in the European Union, there is also a specialized body, a specialized agency, the Fundamental Rights Agency, that is responsible for tracking the state of human rights in the Union and also in the immediate neighborhood of the European Union. So the Fundamental Rights Agency and its annual reports also offer us valuable insights into what might be some of the challenges in understanding the current landscape of human rights. And indeed, based on the Fundamental Rights Report published this year for findings from 2024, we can see that gender equity, freedom of speech, and diversity are recurring topics. Next slide. And what I think is particularly interesting here is this issue of gender gap among youth. We have growing body of data that can empirically prove that we are noticing ideological differences among youngest voters, among the youngest citizens, along ideological lines, with young women tending to tilt more to the left and young men tending to tilt more to the right, which might be a rejection of a call towards greater gender equity, gender mainstreaming, a phenomenon that definitely merits further consideration. But one of the reasons why I wanted to shed light on this particular issue is because we can see very similar tendencies across the globe. So this is not exclusively a European phenomenon. For example, the issue of ideological gap, particularly among young voters, has been instrumental in this year's accelerated election in the Republic of Korea. Some Taiwanese political scientists are also exploring this phenomenon, particularly trying to understand more sympathy towards populist arguments among young Taiwanese men. So coming back to the idea of creating a more horizontal conversation today, I believe that this is one issue that might be worth zooming into. Next slide. And then when we zoom out once again and try to see that we are shedding light on three very particular issues in terms of decline of human rights in the European context and the connection between this analysis and public sentiment elaborated in the most recent Eurobarometer, we can see that these issues really don't exist in a vacuum. So there are very clear connections between the questions of gender equity, the questions of freedom of speech and information integrity, and questions of diversity that translate into our understanding of the online space. And I believe that with many young citizens identifying as digital natives, this understanding of intersectional resilience is very much not only a talking point, but something that we should view more of an action item. So specifically in the context of information resilience, we not only can, but should understand it as an intersectional endeavor, where our understanding of threats in the information space can be understood through the societal perception of gender-related issues, generational divide, and sometimes even other socio-demographic measures, such as linguistic cleavage lines. Next slide. So when I speak about resilience as a task, as a destination in our human rights work, I do want to stress that resilience is most optimally operationalized when we think of it as a form of course correction rather than return to the status quo ante. So resilience is now a very hot word, whether we think about the Taiwanese context where whole of society resilience makes headlines almost daily after the establishment of the relevant committee under the presidential office, or in the European context where resilience has become one of the keywords in defining the direction of the European external action as early as in 2017 when the European Union defined principled pragmatism as the new strategic direction for its external action, meaning both foreign and security policy. But resilience shouldn't only mean that we are able to withstand an exogenous or endogenous shock and keep doing business as usual. It is about adjusting the way that we do things so that the impact of future shocks is not so large. And I believe that the course correction that we need in a lot of human rights work is precisely focused on intersectionality, which in turn we can operationalize as concurrent, parallel consideration of factors that are shaping discrimination, privilege, also in the information space. Next slide. So the reason why we can think about it this way and understand, for example, the intersection of information resilience with gender equity is that especially when we look at threats to information resilience that come from outside, so through foreign information manipulation and interference techniques, it is a threat to our democratic processes and institutions. So understanding any cleavage lines that are trying to make our societies weaker is the ultimate task for our adversaries, because the weaker the society is internally, the less empowered it is to respond to external threats. At the same time, in the current context, in the context of geopolitical change, growing isolationism, and far-right populist tendencies, we see assault on the political action that is supposed to facilitate domestic cohesion building. For example, along gender lines or generational lines or linguistic fault lines. And then there is still a lot of space for third-wave democracies, such as Central Eastern European countries and third-wave democracies in East Asia, like Taiwan and the Philippines, to work together, capitalizing on their shared trajectories of political development. Next slide. And next slide. So, for example, in Europe, we see that Gender-based disinformation that is targeting specifically the LGBTQI+ community is one of the most commonly perpetuated narratives by Russian adversaries, precisely because the issue of LGBTQI+ inclusion is very easily exploited along the lines of, for example, religious cleavages or the urban-rural divide, therefore creating these points of penetration through the holes in the cohesiveness of the social fabric of European liberal democracies. Next slide. So in research from the European External Action Service, and specifically the Department of Strategic Communication that is responsible for understanding FEMI activities that are targeting European democracies, we see that Russian originated disinformation against LGBTQI+ people was disseminated in over 15 unique languages, including 9 official EU languages, and it is often timed very specifically to capitalize on the shape of the news cycle and target the vulnerable publics at especially volatile times. For example, events connected to Pride Month or celebrations of international days of action like the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. Next slide. And Taiwan is not immune from these narratives as well. So you might remember the very polarized discourse on participation of women in Olympic sports during the most recent Olympic Games, when Lin Yuting was subject to very similar attacks in the information space as Imane Khalif of Algeria. And even though, to my understanding, there are no reports that are currently tracing these specific FEMI campaigns that were drawn along gender lines to Russian adversaries, the choice of narratives is demonstrating that there is at least a lot of note comparing happening between China as the main actor behind FEMI operations in Taiwan and Russia. Next slide. There are some very interesting examples from Europe about what can be done to address these human rights challenges that I have mentioned. So, for example, in Denmark, with regard to combating challenges to gender inclusion and gender rights as human rights, the government has published an action plan for men's and boys' gender equality, conceptually going into narratives of new alternative masculinities where conversation about gender equity is focused on empowering men as actors of change rather than as those on the receiving end of the blame game around gender inequality. Next slide. Many organizations are also trying to empower youth audiences to participate in peer-to-peer and train-the-trainer frameworks to promote media literacy in the most local communities. Next slide. And several initiatives have also empowered young professionals to lend their skills to improving the situations of migrants and asylum seekers. And one of such organizations is a cross-national body, Equal Rights Beyond Borders, headquartered in both Germany and Greece, that encourages young legal professionals to engage in research and also pro bono representations of migrants, trying to address the issue of systematic injustice in the immigration justice systems across Europe. Next slide. Next slide. So what does it mean? I believe that we can try to focus on this short and actionable acronym. Whatever action that we develop should be our eyes. It should be intersectional, it should be context-specific, and empowering. Next slide. Intersectionality reminds us that human rights don't exist in a vacuum, and we should look at these issues in parallel. Context-specific issues are also pointing to other sensitivities that might shape public opinions on human rights and support for populist action at the expense of human rights, for example, along the lines of urban-rural divide. So even though we see a lot of similarities between various global contexts in how human rights issues transpire and how challenges to human rights regimes transpire, action needs to be localized and implemented in close collaboration or by local leaders who already have the trust of target groups. And last but not least, empowerment means a sense of ownership. And I think that it is very visible in action, for example, along gender lines, where individuals whom we have conventionally understood as perpetrators of human rights violations can also be given a sense of responsibility and therefore a sense of ownership in targeted action. I understand that the time is up, so let me wrap up here, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
My name is Ali. I came from Indonesia. So earlier you explained about the ICE methods, and I also underlined about how the activism or how the contribution of the youth in terms of this case. So I just curious about in what ways can actually a youth activism effectively bridge the urban rural divide to promote human rights in both local and global contexts, because at this point we will talk about in international level, right? So we talk about the various culture or various backgrounds, but on my side of the world there are some of difficulties in terms of talking the policymakers, and also the contributions of the youth. So yeah, maybe from your personal perspective, how do you tackle this issue to bridging between the local communities and the policymakers? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just see if there are any other questions. Maybe I can take them in conjunction. I see one more. Anyone on this side? So the gentleman in the green jacket, please.
Hello, I'm Carlos from the Philippines. Thank you so much for the very insightful lecture. My question is also a bit tangent to the question asked earlier. There is a recent trend of the youth being much more passive in their activism, as with the examples of online petitions or probably posting their opinions online. But the question I have is, since the current world right now is facing a very large democratic backsliding, is it fine for the youth to continually be passive in their activism, or do we really require a much more proactive stance to be much more active in voicing out these opinions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the third one over here, please, the person in white.
Hello. Okay. Good afternoon. I am Ernest. I'm a graduate student here in Taipei at the National Chongqing University, and currently serving as the managing editor of the student think tank for Europe-Asia relations. So I want to put some flavor of regional integration in this value system. I really like when you say that there is a values-based divide in Europe itself. And I think EU has a large role to play in it. And with EU having these normative values in place, and the values of multilateralism, rule of law, democratic values in place, when they try to build its relationship with Asia, the context in Asia, which you said earlier should be context specific to local values, it's different. So for example, let's look at the case of the Solomon Islands in the Pacific and the ASEAN. So when the European Union goes to Asia and the Pacific, majority of Asian countries and the Pacific Island countries prefer bilateral approaches rather than multilateral approaches. And these normative values that EU is upholding in the international system is being targeted when they try to pursue their normative values in this side of the world. So my question is, how do you think as to what extent can the EU compromise these very values that they have established for quite some time for them to build relationships here in Asia and the Pacific? That's my question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these three questions. Let me start with the first point about the importance of participation at local level. Of course, you know, if I was an advocate for perpetual apathy as a panacea to the ills of democratic systems and human rights regimes, then I don't think that we would be meeting right here. So, of course, to some extent, I understand that I'm preaching to the choir and a self-selected group of people who consider themselves young leaders and young activists, and I can only reiterate that activism matters. But at the end of the day, particularly in electoral systems, irrespective of whether you come from a large city or a more rural place, votes matter. So I think that it is extremely important for young people to be active, especially in the formal channels of political participation, for example, in elections, to send a very strong message to elected officials who seek re-election or to aspiring politicians that young people are a constituency that really matters. And I think that it would also be great to see more young people engage in formal democratic processes, not only on the side of electing your representatives, but also in terms of being elected. So actually, in the Fundamental Rights Report from 2025, which I mentioned, the Fundamental Rights Agency has identified a relatively high median age of members of the European Parliament as one of the structural issues that is hindering participation of youth or youth mainstreaming in the policy-making process. Of course, every country has its own idiosyncrasies in how the institutions of electoral democracy are designed. But for example, in Taiwan, I think that it's quite impressive that the local administration happens on so many different levels, all the way from neighborhood and village chiefs up to city mayors and county magistrates, which provides a lot of entry points even for younger, less experienced individuals to gain experience in the political process. So let's remember that our electoral rights are not only about the right to elect, but it's also about the right to be elected. And the question about balancing interests and norms in European external action is, of course, a very difficult one, and one that puzzles the External Action Service and the Council in the foreign configuration all the time. I believe that in the EUGS, which I referenced as well in 2017, the EU has already indicated a shift towards a more interest-based geopolitical approach with defining principled pragmatism as the main feature of European common foreign policy and common security and defense policy. But the actual implementation remains to be seen. I believe that it really is a defining characteristic of the European Union to be a norm shaper, and the Brussels effect is a real aspiration. So I wouldn't see any dramatic shifts in that approach. Thank you.